in 19, that was Paul Robeson. The transcript read by James Earl Gray. Is that right? And the hearing was in 1956. But that's really the way they went. Vicious attacks. Robeson had already been on the blacklist. They took his passport away from him, and it was a time when that as we studied earlier, when we had people like Jimmy Burns, who had been was governor of South Carolina, and while he was acting vice president under Truman, that he segued very smoothly from just the old Jim Crow language into blaming the awakening of the black people in America to the fact that they were being oppressed. That was the communists and the union organizers that were going down there and stirring up people. And so when you see it written and you see it argued, it's just so transparent the way the others are blamed. Now, you pick your other. Becky just posted on the chat thing um, some information from the House of Un-American Activities Committee on Modjeska. And we also have a video clip of the sheriff, I guess it was in the 60s, when Frank Powell, who I knew, um, was excoriating Ms. Simkins for being a communist and talking about how he was waving the HUAC thing, saying there's over 30 organizations here, communist fronts that she's a part of. And the Southern Negro Youth Congress was one of them. But I wanted to, before we introduce our guest this evening and let Dr. Green do that, I wanted to tell you about how I met Dr. Erik Gellman. And we had started the Modjeska School discussions by 2014 and 15. What a great idea it would be to try and train people up to be able to carry on the struggle. And we're in her house. Now, some of you may have heard me, if you've been Modjeska students or been around me for a few minutes, you may have heard this story, but trust me, there's some people that haven't. And so when we were working on starting the Modjeska School, we got the first class going in 2015. And in 2016, early 2016, I was at a voting rights conference at Loyola in New Orleans of executive directors of groups around the South that do voting rights. And I spoke to these people that were getting burned out because we've been doing what we were doing for so long, and it was not that much success, about how we keep doing it. And I quoted my mentor as being asked, how do you keep doing this decade after decade? And she said, well, I guess I'm just selfish because it makes me feel good. And when it was over with, this guy came up to me and he said, I know who your mentor was. And I said, well, who? He said, Modjeska Simkins. I said, how do you know that? He said, well, I did my PhD thesis on the 1946 conference. And I made another best friend for life. It was Dr. Sekou Franklin, teaching at Middle Tennessee State University, where Becky took her undergraduate degree. And that Dr. Franklin said, you've got to meet Dr. Erik Gellman, who just cranked out this book, first book written on the National Negro Congress and its affiliate, the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And so I did reach out to Dr. Gellman, and he showed up at the event that we did in 2016 on the 70th anniversary of the Southern Negro Youth Congress in Columbia, and that we did it at the Township Auditorium. There was no one that I knew that worked for the county that owns the building, including the people of color that run the building, or anybody that I've been talking with that understood the magnitude, the international impact of that event in Columbia in October 1946. So that's what we're going to dive into tonight. And Dr. Green, bring on Dr. Gellman.
Thanks so much for that great introduction, Brett. Again, welcome back to Modjeska School for Human Rights. This evening, we have a very special guest, Dr. Erik Gellman from the University of North Carolina. Now, this evening, of course, he's going to spend some time talking about the Southern Negro Youth Congress's 1946 convention, what brought them to Columbia in 1946 in the first place, and talking about the greater sphere of activism and radicalism that was in the Deep South throughout the 1930s and 40s. And I'm definitely really excited about this presentation, as I know everyone else is here this evening. So, of course, as is the case with many Zoom conversations and talks these days, let me give Dr. Gellman a quick introduction. Hopefully, it'll be one that will really capture the depth and breadth of what he has worked on during his great career. Of course, Dr. Erik S. Gellman is currently a professor at the University of North Carolina. He actually researches and teaches a great deal about working class life, urban life throughout the 20th century. Of course, he is the author of Death Blow to Jim Crow, the National Negro Congress and the Rise of Militant Civil Rights. Before that, he was a co-author of The Gospel of the Working Class, Labor's Southern Prophets in New Deal America. His most recent work is Troublemakers, Chicago Freedom Struggles through the lens of Art Shea, which actually looks a bit more at how activism combines with text and visual culture to really lay out the history of Chicago's politics after World War II. Of course, Dr. Gellman has also been heavily involved in working class history and labor history. He serves as the contributing editor to Labor Studies and Working Class History, and is also the National Secretary for the Labor and Working Class History Association. Of course, before he came down south, he worked at Roosevelt University in Chicago. But again, Dr. Gellman is one of the foremost historians on labor experience in 20th century America, and I think all of us are deeply honored to have him here this evening. So everyone, please give a warm virtual applause to Dr. Erik Gellman.
Thanks, Dr. Green, and thanks, Becky. Thanks, Brett. I really appreciate everyone being here this evening. I will add one slight thing to my introduction that Dr. Green wouldn't have known, which is that my ancestors are from Columbia, South Carolina. In fact, my grandmother grew up just outside of town, was a poor farmer, Jewish child of Jewish immigrants. And some of my relatives are in fact buried in that tiny little cemetery that many of you probably know that has been dwarfed by the football field, but can't be moved by it. Do you know, does anyone know what I'm talking about? That teeny little cemetery? Anyway, so I have a lot of affinity for Columbia and South Carolina, and that's where some of my relatives are from. So today what I want to do is talk informally and maybe for 20 or 30 minutes. And then what I hope to have happen is a very robust dialogue, Q&A, where we talk about all of the different complexities of the 1930s, 1940s Black freedom struggle. And specifically South Carolina, but also the sort of larger political dimensions and international political dimensions. So what I want to do is I'm going to start by describing a little bit about what the Southern Negro Youth Congress was, why it formed, and what it did before Columbia. And then I'm going to just briefly talk about why Columbia, South Carolina. Why did this happen in October of 1946? Talk a little bit about the Southern Youth Legislature that happened in Columbia that was so influential at that moment. And then what happened afterwards, right? Why wasn't this plan of action that was put together and assembled in Columbia implemented? And I think you all probably know some of the answers to that question, but I think it's an important question, historical question, thinking about activists and social movements in particular. So I'm going to try to share my screen here.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming while we're trying to get the glitches out. And I see Rev Tom Summers, who I'm just so delighted always to see that he's still on the same side of the earth that I am. Thank you, Tom. And appreciate everybody showing up tonight.
Okay, that should be coming your way soon. All right. So while we're waiting for the images, let me start talking a little bit about what was the Southern Negro Youth Congress. Many of you have probably heard about the SNYC, or you could even refer to it as SNYC, the first SNYC, right? The SNYC that we often talk about is one that happened in 1960, but this is an earlier formation. So in the 1930s, what you had is the largest group of African Americans graduating from college in American history. And that was quite an accomplishment, but you can imagine that they were graduating into, few opportunities in Depression era America. That, there were no jobs to be had, there were no opportunities. And so that was one reason, I think, why so many young people gravitated towards this activist network. But I think the more important reason is that a lot of young African Americans were radicalized in the 1930s. They saw what happened with the Scottsboro case. They saw what happened with Angelo Herndon being arrested under false charges of conspiracy in Atlanta, Georgia. And they were responding to a very famous article by Langston Hughes called "Cowards from the Colleges." I don't know if any of you are familiar with this essay, but I'd be happy to send a copy along after this presentation. In 1934, Langston Hughes challenged young African Americans, especially in college. He called them spineless Uncle Toms, full of mental and moral evasions. He was trying to provoke, right? And what he was suggesting is that college students shouldn't act in their own self-interest or for their own individual careers, but should service that knowledge in support of social movements and anti-racist activism. And so as a result, a lot of African Americans start to rebel against their college administrations. Some are thrown out of their colleges, and these are these are historically Black colleges as well, that at the time were very conservative. And they come together and form the Southern Negro Youth Congress in 1937. Now, what's interesting about the early days of the Southern Negro Youth Congress is that if you could go back one slide, Dr. Green, thank you. Oh, that's perfect, thanks. They initially headquartered themselves in Richmond, Virginia. And what was incredible about what happened in Richmond was that, here the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the CIO, had just formed, and they were not interested at all in organizing Black workers right away, especially not in the South. But the Southern Negro Youth Congress goes into Richmond. They organize tobacco stemmers and other tobacco workers in the city of Richmond successfully. So successfully, in fact, that the CIO grudgingly has to take on several locals of organized workers that become a really important part of this Southern movement story, because they're the earliest tobacco workers that, sort of form this thing that Robert Korstad comes to call civil rights unionism. The idea that unions were not just about paychecks and raises and seniority, but could be a social movement as well. And what the Southern Negro Youth Congress achieved in Richmond, Virginia in 1937, 38, 39 was really quite remarkable, in that they organized these workers that nobody thought could be organized. And they organized them not just in terms of employment, but in terms of changing the dynamics and the power structure of the city of Richmond. So this is a really powerful story about, workers who were the kind of most exploited workers. These were not even tobacco factory workers, most of them. They were stemmers of tobacco, where they were stemming tobacco by hand in these barns that had no open windows and had all kinds of health issues, et cetera. And this young group organizes older workers, younger workers together into this amazing formation. Then the Southern Negro Youth Congress branches out more. Local councils erupt in all kinds of interesting places in the South, including, in this photo, you see a very young Lou Burnham. Lou Burnham is really important to organizing the Southern Negro Youth Congress convention in Columbia in October of 1946. Here, though, we see him during World War II, And he's speaking out in New Orleans for a right to vote rally in the middle of the war. So the New Orleans Council of the SNYC focused on voting rights early on and was actually quite successful in getting more access to the ballot in and around New Orleans during World War II. Burnham was typical of this generation. He had read Cowards from the Colleges by Langston Hughes. He had become radicalized during the Depression. He was born in the Barbados, but it was raised in Harlem in the 1930s, and was a really important leader for the Southern Negro Youth Congress, alongside his wife, Dorothy Burnham, who married him in 1941. She had gone to Brooklyn College, similar trajectory of activism and radicalism in New York. And then they both moved to Alabama in 1941 to take up full-time work for the Southern Negro Youth Congress across the South. Let's go to the next slide. So here's a photo that you would think is quite innocuous, a couple of teenagers playing ping pong with each other. But I think this really represents what the Southern Negro Youth Congress was doing during World War II. They set up what they called youth centers around Birmingham that seemed rather innocuous politically, but were anything but. They became real incubators of cultural and political activism, especially for young people. And a lot of young people might have been drawn in by like the ping pong, or, you could see these pieces of art in the background that are really interesting here. There was probably some kind of like art show or art competition amongst these young people as well. Bringing culture, politics, leisure all together during the war. And just a couple of examples of what was coming out of these youth centers. One person named Mildred McAdory ran the Fairfield, Alabama Youth Center. One day after closing up the youth center, she was taking the bus back into the downtown of Birmingham and decided she was going to move the segregated sign. She was arrested. She defied arrest. She was beaten up, thrown in jail, and was let out of jail a couple of days later. And of course, that didn't spark a mass movement, but I just find that so interesting that here's Mildred McAdory, doing exactly what Rosa Parks did only more than a decade before. And she was a real fiery activist who, may not have been as good a representative as Rosa Parks was in terms of her respectability. Mildred was younger and she was fiery, and, she wasn't necessarily only going to engage in nonviolence. And then another youth center worker was a young woman by the name of Sally Davis. Sally Davis helped run one of the other youth centers around Birmingham while raising her very young daughter named Angela Davis. And so you can see the connection there of what is incubating in those youth centers to think about those formative years that Angela Davis spent in Alabama around her mother, probably in these youth centers, right, as a child, as Sally Davis tried to run the youth center and take care of her young daughter. So let's move on to the next slide. Yes, so at the end of the war, what you get is an escalation of tactics and militants in terms of the Southern Negro Youth Congress. This is a photograph of the Oust Bilbo campaign from Washington, D.C., where this is actually a National Negro Congress campaign. But I think this is interesting in that you see really young people on the picket line as well. By the time you get to the end of the war, I would argue that the lines between the National Negro Congress on the one hand and the Southern Negro Youth Congress on the other become really blurred in terms of generations. This helps make sense of why Ms. Simkins was so involved in the Southern Negro Youth Congress, even though she was older. Similarly, you have young people working with the National Negro Congress in DC, and they're really coming out after the war, hoping for a mass movement, hoping that the war will bring about democracy in the United States. And of course, Bilbo was the worst of the worst in terms of the Southern segregationist, white supremacist senators. He was elected by hardly, anyone in his district in Mississippi because so many people were barred from voting there. He openly advocated for lynching. And what was also really important about Bilbo that's not very well known is in 1945, he became the chairman of the Committee on DC Affairs. So, to this day, right, we've got the Senate and the Congress that control the District of Columbia, and there's a fight for DC statehood. Similarly, in the 40s, the National Negro Congress had a mass movement against police brutality in DC. They were trying to upend Jim Crow in the nation's capital, but specifically over the issue of police brutality and racialized violence that they connected to lynching. So here you have these Oust Bilbo signs, and I'm sure these NNC people must have also wanted to oust Bilbo to get him off that DC committee because he was blocking so much social change from happening by being the head of the Committee on DC Affairs. Lots of activism going on in right after the war, and especially in places like Washington, DC. Okay, let's go to the next slide. If you will, Dr. Green, thanks. And I should say one more thing about DC. Just 1 month before the conference in Columbia, a huge event happened in DC that nobody is aware of anymore, which is the crusade to end lynching. Paul Robeson, who opened up our class this evening, headed the crusade to end lynching. And a huge delegation of people from all around the country descended upon DC in September to confront Truman over his terrible record on civil rights. Even Albert Einstein joined the committee of the crusade to end lynching in DC. So you can imagine the kind of auspicious moment that just 1 month before the Columbia Conference in the mock legislature in Columbia, you've got all of this mobilization, African-American-led mobilization happening around the country. This slide, though, references something a lot less noticeable, but just as important. And I'm sure all of you as students of the Simkins School will appreciate that leadership training schools, political leadership training schools like this are as important. They're not mobilization, but they're organizing and education. And Southern Negro Youth Congress led a really important 2-week program at Harbison Junior College in Irmo in August of 1946. Couple of dozen students from all over South Carolina, some from out of state, trained there. They collaborated with the Highlander Folk School, which I'm sure many of you must know, having studied social movements, the famous activist training school in DC. And this was super important in terms of not just activism, but also the kind of education on race that happened at this school. Getting students to understand that the kind of ideas and assumptions about race in America were socially constructed and indeed absurd. They took all kinds of quizzes and tests and had all kinds of interesting programming, including music and other things. So Irmo and the leadership training school there was a really important precursor to what happened in Columbia, South Carolina. So that said, why South Carolina? Why Columbia in October of 1946? Well, one practical way to describe it is that the Southern Negro Youth Congress had previously had conferences in Virginia, Tennessee, Alabama, Louisiana, and Georgia, but they had never actually met in South Carolina. But I think more important to that was that the young leaders in the Southern Negro Youth Congress saw what was happening in South Carolina during the war. They understood and knew about McCain. They understood and knew about Simkins and McCrae and the Progressive Democratic Party that challenged the regular Democratic Party in the Chicago Convention. And they were really impressed. That's why they thought South Carolina was the world's firing line. that they wanted to meet there and center their activism there over this conference that would happen in Columbia. Also, I think they wanted to meet in Columbia because they were very well aware of who at the time was Secretary of State, James Burns. Jimmy Burns, was a notorious, infamous South Carolina politician. And in fact, I make the argument in my book that James Burns probably would have become vice president in 1944 had it not been for the objection of the Progressive Democratic Party from South Carolina and other prominent Black leaders in the Democratic Party. And you can only imagine what would have happened if James Burns would have become vice president in 1944. Roosevelt dies in 1945, so James Burns would have been president of the country, you know, leading us out of the war and into the post-war era, which would have been disastrous. Almost as bad, though, of course, was James Burns trying to lead the United States in the world by negotiating with the Soviet Union during this crucial post-war period. And the activists in the Southern Negro Youth Congress thought that this was so hypocritical. The idea that this guy who advocated segregation and discrimination in his home state was supposed to lead the world in trying to figure out how to create democracy and post-war peace. So all of those things, I think, are the reason that they chose Columbia, South Carolina. So let me tell you a little bit about the legislature that came together on those 3 days in October of 1946. Hopefully you got a chance to read a little bit of the chapter that I think goes into greater detail. So I'll just be brief and summarize a few points. The first is, I think what's so significant about what happened there is that you all know the expression, "this is what democracy looks like." It's often a slogan that people throw around, right, et cetera. But this really was what democracy looked like. This was Southern Negro Youth Congress bringing delegates together to actually legislate their own post-war program over that weekend. So it wasn't just a number of ceremonial speeches and gestures. There was a sense of urgency to actually put together a program over that weekend that would then be implemented over the next years by the Southern Negro Youth Congress and their allies, which I think is quite interesting. Second, I think what's so important is that this conference reoriented the geography of the Black freedom movement. Before 1946 in October, most activists, anti-racist activists, civil rights activists, thought of the movement as being in the North, in the Midwest, or on the West Coast. That the South was something that would come later. And I think that's really important to understand that, there was a feeling that it was easier to sort of crack Jim Crow in places like Chicago or San Francisco or New York. But this was the key moment where things got reoriented, most famously by Du Bois, right? His famous Behold the Land speech. He comes to Columbia, South Carolina. He gives the keynote address on the final day of the conference. And he tells the audience that we don't need to be fighting elsewhere. We labored on this land for centuries. We built the South. We should be in the South, not trying to escape it. And our activism should begin here, right? And that was a really key turning point for the Black freedom struggle, I think. Du Bois says also in this speech that there had been 3 centuries of what he said was the flat failure of white civilization. And it was about time that African Americans took the vanguard against this flat failure of white civilization. The third thing that I think is super important to understand is just how much of this assembly looked back to the first Reconstruction that happened in the 1870s. The Reconstruction that Du Bois so elegantly wrote about in his famous book, Black Reconstruction in America from 1935. One delegate, Jack Odell, who would go on to be a preeminent Black activist and intellectual who just passed away actually a couple of years ago. I mean, a stunning, such an important person. as a teenager, he attended the Southern Youth Legislature in Columbia. And the first thing he noticed when he entered the auditorium was that there is these big banners of all of the Black representatives who had served in Congress and in the Senate during the first Reconstruction in the 1870s. And he said he hadn't even known there were Black elected representatives during Reconstruction, right? The entire history of Reconstruction had been wiped away. African Americans were not taught it in school except clandestinely by Black teachers and others who remembered that era as so pivotal. And so this was a real coming out of the revisionist view of Reconstruction that, of course, today is the accepted view of Reconstruction because it's the truth, right? What really happened in the 1870s during radical Reconstruction, a Black-led social movement. And the people in Columbia in 1946 really wanted to think about that Reconstruction for their own movement that they were so optimistic about occurring in 1946, so all those years later. So if we could back up a couple of slides here, I want to just point out, here's the program for the Southern Youth Legislature with a really great drawing, showing young children busting out of the walls of segregation and discrimination. And then here's the pamphlet that later got sold by the Southern Negro Youth Congress of Du Bois's speech, "Behold the Land," because it really represented sort of their pivot towards the South and thinking about a mass movement in the post-war era. The artist of that pamphlet is a famous artist by the name of Charles White, who worked for the National Negro Congress for a time before he went on to greater fame as one of the most significant Black artists of the 20th century. The next slide. And here are just a couple of thousands of documents that I just wanted to highlight for you all. This is, these are two of the speeches, the transcripts of the speeches from the Columbia Conference. And I want to just read you a couple of sentences from each. The first one is the speech of Esther Cooper Jackson. I don't know if you've had the pleasure of learning about Esther Cooper Jackson, but she is one of the most amazing activists in the 20th century. She led the Southern Negro Youth Congress during World War II and went on to she's still alive, believe it or not, and she's like 100 years old, living in the Boston area. Here's what she had to say. "We have come here to Columbia in the heart of South Carolina, in the social heart of the Deep South, to rearm ourselves with a deeper realization of our condition and our needs. We have come for inspiration and fraternity, but above all, we have come to give voice and strength and organizational power to the burning and unsilenceable demand of our generation for the right to live and prosper, free from the terror of the lyncher's rope, free from the reality of job insecurity and the specter of starvation, free to acquire an education and cast off forever the veil of ignorance, free from the hatred and indignity of Jim Crow." So she goes on in this really fiery speech that is quite amazing in laying out a program for young people in the South to create a mass movement there. The other document on the other side of the screen is a transcript of Paul Robeson's speech from the conference. And here I'll read a couple of lines from the last page of this great transcript. You can see here, I don't know if you can see it actually, but you see where I've highlighted "Go Down Moses," "Scandalize My Name," "Waterboy." So those were the three songs he sang to the audience at the beginning of his talk. That must have been quite amazing to have him do that a cappella in the middle of his speech. But at the end of his speech, he really also sort of articulates the moment, this post-war moment of great optimism. He says, "We move forward for courage, for fighting, and for suffering that belongs to us, the Negro people, together with many others, with labor and with other minorities. But we are at the forefront. We have been challenged. We have been told that we must not ask and we must never assert our rights to freedom. With our allies here and in other parts of the world, we will gain our freedom. We will gain that dignity of which we are so proud. There are no more dignified and prouder people than our forebears in Africa. Human dignity is important to us. We want to walk the earth with our shoulders back, knowing that we are free, free like any other people on the face of the earth. Thanks to you and to many others, we will be. So that's how Robeson ended his speech in South Carolina. And of course, Du Bois probably gave the most famous speech at the conference, but you read about that in the chapter, so I won't go over that again. So what happened to this plan of action? Oh, actually, the last slide, I forgot about this last slide here. This slide is actually one that I'd never seen before, but when I came down for the anniversary of the SNYC conference in Columbia, the head of the manuscripts division of the Carolina Library at the university sent this to me afterwards. It's a photograph of the dance that happened on the Saturday night of the Columbia legislature. And I just love this slide because it shows that, you know, the conference was very serious, it was political, it was fiery, but here is this huge dance, right? A celebratory moment of optimism that happened in the midst of this important conference as well. Okay, so what happened to the plan of action? After, and I'll come, yeah, thanks. After the conference, what became of the Southern Negro Youth Congress? And what about its plan of action? As you know, the atmosphere politically, culturally, socially for dissent became more and more narrowed. And the reasons for optimism started to dim once you got into 1947 and 1948. The labor movement largely abandoned Black workers in the South through their program called Operation Dixie, which was a huge strategic error. It makes me think of the workers in Bessemer, Alabama, who were just fighting against Amazon. The government ramped up repression of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, as we saw by that Paul Robeson testimony that started off our class. But also the Communist Party became more sectarian in response and more kind of divisive in a defensive posture against all of this repression. And as a result, the Southern Negro Youth Congress got caught in that maelstrom and folded a couple of years later. In fact, they had one more conference which occurred in Birmingham, Alabama, 2 years later. You know, what a difference 2 years makes. Bull Connor, the same Bull Connor that becomes infamous in the 1960s, broke up that conference in Birmingham because they were defying the laws of segregation. And so on the one hand, you get the demise of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, and people have forgotten about it, even to this day. But on the other hand, the impact, I want to argue, was actually quite large. What the Southern Negro Youth Congress did is they forced liberals like President Truman to embrace a domesticated civil rights strategy, which wasn't the strategy of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, but it was a blueprint for the civil rights movement to come in the 1950s. To secure these rights, the report that the Truman Commission put out was largely a response against the radicalism of the Southern Negro Youth Congress and a means to kind of toe the line between promoting civil rights but not promoting this leftist version of civil rights that I would argue was an internationalist version that was economic and that was actually beyond civil rights. It was more of a human rights agenda, which I think is a key distinction. But also, I think what's important is that while a lot of these activists went to jail, got deported, couldn't get a job, you know, had to wait tables, had to drive buses, etc. Like after this, you know, McCarthyism, and they even got blacklisted from those jobs. Many of them stayed around, and they were around when later generations came up in the 60s. Freedomways magazine is just one example of the Southern Negro Youth Congress existing after its demise. And I think Du Bois was right that the firing line for the movement was going to be in the South. You know, he just didn't see that the firing line would be in a very different moment and over a very different agenda in the 1950s and 60s. I'll end by saying something that Lou Burnham said after the demise of the Southern Negro Youth Congress. He said, the central lesson of Negro history was that it was not a straight path, but it was a zigzag road of fits and starts. And I think that's important to understanding social movements, and that's what the folks in the Southern Negro Youth Congress understood. It wasn't this linear progress narrative that Americans are so comfortable with, but rather one of continued engagement and fits and starts in a zigzag road. And I think the Southern Negro Youth Congress played such an impactful and important role, specifically in Columbia, South Carolina, but also in other places in the South, of the Black freedom struggle. So thanks for listening. And now I really look forward to questions or a dialogue or however you want to go from here.
Thank you, Erik. I want to add a couple of points that I think are kind of like home points that I didn't know you had relatives in South Carolina. We're canceling your interstate transportation ability, and you're going to come home. We need you here. But thank you so much for all the good work. But I want to lift up some things that rang bells to me when I was trying to figure out why was this conference here. And Dr. Gellman pointing out to the really international posture that Jimmy Burns had at the time is something we can't underestimate. But other things were happening that we're now hearing more about. And one of them was the blinding of Isaac Woodard in February in Batesburg, Leesville. And then the subsequent trial that ended up in front of Wadey's Warings, who was the guy that was the one that was pushing to not argue for buses, but to end public segregation at the same time. That the blinding of Isaac Woodard caught, oh my goodness, the fellow that had the radio show, Orson Welles. Orson Welles. This was before the internet even. This was before television. People used radio. And Orson Welles had an NBC national radio program. And they're on your study guide now. If you're a Modjeska student, you can go listen to 4 segments that Welles did on a national radio. And I think it was in April, about the blinding of Isaac Woodard and excoriating the fact that not only happened, but the guys got off with it. And so shortly after that, there was a fundraiser for Isaac Woodard in New York City, with 25 or 30,000 people and all the A-listers of the time singing or performing. And then at the same time, the Supreme Court is hearing the last gasp of white-only primaries. They'd ruled against Texas, they'd ruled against Georgia's white-only primary. So the last place in America that had a circumstance where that you had to be white to vote in the primary was South Carolina. And the governor of South Carolina, Johnson, had called a special session and changed a couple hundred laws in South Carolina to turn the South Carolina Democratic Party into a private club. And so the world was watching South Carolina as we led up to the things that Erik spoke of and the other things that are going on, combined with the fact that the leadership of McCain and Modjeska and others, Hinton and others, in that time after in the war, Modjeska was involved with A. Philip Randolph and getting better jobs for people of color during the New Deal. But there was a really strong movement with a newspaper, and they had a political party. They crashed the Democratic Party 20 years before Fannie Lou Hamer did. So this was a time that we really need to appreciate. They stood tall, and then what happened? And that's what we need to understand. And we'll get into that with the question is, what happened? Why don't we know about that? And that competent, threatening attack on white supremacy and fascism and imperialism and colonialism was the predicate of that. And so the more effective you get, Modjeska said, the more the pressure comes down, the more the movement builds up. But she also said things would be real different if SNYC hadn't been smashed. And so we're going to get into that. Robert, you want to lead the question?
Oh, sure, definitely. And I want to really encourage folks to put questions in the chat as they come to you. I know there's already a question there. And before we get to that question, I did want to highlight something Erik mentioned at the end of his talk about the magazine Freedomways, which is one of my own personal favorite resources. Now, I've had for years the Freedomways Reader, which was edited by Esther Cooper Jackson. But in recent years, JSTOR, the great academic journal site, they've actually posted online in PDF form all the issues of Freedomways. And I'll put that in the chat right now. It's not only a great research resource, but it's just actually really cool to look for those back issues. But it's also a little concerning because a lot of the things they're talking about in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s are issues we're still dealing with in 2021. Of course, I would think a lot of the activists writing for Freedomways back then would have said, these are the same things we dealt with back in the 30s and 40s. So there you go. Now, there was a question in the chat going back to what Erik was saying about the various youth centers that you mentioned before. Jerry asked, how were those youth centers funded?
Not well. There's a story about when Esther Cooper Jackson, who ran the Southern Negro Youth Congress, finally decided to go full-time into the movement. She had an offer to go do a PhD at University of Chicago, and she had completed a master's thesis that was excellent about the exploitation of Black domestic workers. And I would guess she was going to U of C to work with probably E. Franklin Frazier or one of these top Black intellectuals there. But instead, and she had received a small fellowship, like maybe a few $100s or something in today's money. And she took the fellowship money and she sunk every penny of it into the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And then she never showed up at University of Chicago because she was busy in Birmingham full-time working for the movement. So all of this activity, that happens in the Southern Negro Youth Congress is largely voluntary. Maybe some small donations from local churches, YMCAs, that kind of a thing. They would sometimes do, little fundraiser picnic type things or political events that had some sort of aspect to it, but they never had any money. And so it was amazing how they were able to run these centers through voluntary labor largely, with like zero funds. And so it was quite incredible. And, for all of the McCarthyites who would later charge that groups like the Southern Negro Youth Congress got all this, Moscow gold, like money from the Communist Party. That's not true. There's not a single dime that the Communist Party is contributing to this, so they really had to just scratch together whatever they could. And none of them, they all had different jobs in and around Birmingham during the war as well. And of course, many of their husbands volunteered to be in the armed forces. So Esther Cooper Jackson's husband, James Jackson, was in Burma. Lou Burnham was away, Edward Strong, et cetera, all the sort of main male Southern Negro Youth Congress leaders were away. But actually that made for a really interesting dynamic during the war of a kind of emergence of a Black female leadership in the Southern Negro Youth Congress that never goes away, right? Like, the NAACP has zero female leadership during the war. In fact, Ella Baker resigns because she's so sick of all these male leaders who are sort of, dismissing her. Yet here's Thelma Dale in New York City leading the NNC, and then Esther Cooper Jackson leading the Southern Negro Youth Congress out of Birmingham. And they're doing all kinds of innovative work against police brutality. Many of you are probably familiar with the Ressie Taylor case. The Southern Negro Youth Congress were the first group to come out and, to defend and try to get the assailants who raped Ressie Taylor brought to justice, right? It was a Black feminist movement in many ways during the war and after. And, I think that's important to know too.
Thank you, Erik. Robert, I want to point out that one of the things that is we learn, this is why we study this stuff, is to learn what could happen to us and to future generations, is that in 47, right after the 46 conference, IRS non-tax status of the Southern Negro Youth Congress was yanked. And these folks didn't have much money, and that was really a crippling thing that happened. And Eric, I'm sure, meant to mention that during the 30s and the 40s, Modjeska Simkins was the black woman who was leading the nation's #1 NAACP conference, and that the leadership of the women there was just incredible, and that's really worth studying in and of itself. Esther Cooper and Dorothy Burnham were in their 20s when they were in Columbia doing this, and the lesson to learn, Modjeska was able to get away with it like she did because her family had money, and that what we have to do to maintain the movement moving is you've got to own it. We can't rely on grant money forever. Robert?
All right, and actually picking up with that note, Ryan asked a question in the chat that I was actually going to get to myself, so I'm glad it was posed now. Ryan Curry said, I know Paul Robeson was high profile and popular in many places around the globe, the Soviet Union, and with miners, other labor groups in England and Wales. How conscious were SNYC leaders of an international dimension to their activities, and what was the international response?
That's a really great question. What I try to argue is that before World War II, there was an international consciousness. If you think about the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, for example, one of the earliest issues of the National Negro Congress was protesting around that fascist invasion of Ethiopia. The Spanish Civil War was another example where you had a lot of young activists, either, some of them volunteered to fight, but many others, raised money, were very conscious of that international situation as fascists and non-fascists were fighting it out in Spain in the late 30s. But I would say it wasn't until the war where these young people really get invested in these international connections. It was like before that, the international connections existed. They were there through the Communist Party and the left that was informing them of a really important kind of anti-colonial struggles around the world. But it wasn't like personal, right? It was more abstract. It was imagined, which is important too. Imagining international solidarity is important in its own right. But by the time you get into the war, with a lot of the men serving overseas in various situations, especially in places like Burma and in the Eastern Front, they come home with a whole new international consciousness. And of course, Osceola McCain lived in Belgium for 20 years and then came back to South Carolina, right? He ran a jazz club in Belgium, right? The only reason he came back was the Nazis invaded the town he was in, and he knew as a black person running a jazz club, he was in trouble. So he came back home, right? And then you have Southern Negro Youth Congress activists going to these international conferences. Esther Cooper Jackson went to one in the early 40s in Mexico City. There was a delegation that went to Cuba in the early 40s. And especially towards the end of the war, though, you get these Thelma Dale, Esther Cooper Jackson, Dorothy Burnham. They're all going to these international democratic, anti-fascist conferences around the world. And they're making these international connections. So it's not imagined anymore, right? It's real for them. And they actually bring international delegates to Columbia who are there amongst the crowd, as well as previous Southern Negro Youth Conferences had various youth delegates from other parts of the world as well. So when they were saying we're on the world's firing line, and they were, talking about India, talking about, Asia, talking about Africa, it was more real in 1946, I think, than it had ever been for them.
That's a very fascinating answer to that question. I'm glad you mentioned some of those things, because I was actually going to ask about McCain in particular, and how, again, he brings this international outlook to what's happening in South Carolina. And I love how in your your chapter, you mentioned how he was so international in his outlook, in fact, that some of his colleagues felt he went a little bit too far. They were afraid that by making it an international thing in scope, that they might alienate some potential supporters from the NAACP too, which I think again is really telling about your larger argument about going from civil rights to human rights. And an interesting question from Cheryl. How impactful were the returning World War I veterans on the movement?
And
World
War I or World War II? Because I could answer either one.
Well, actually, I would just go ahead with both. I would go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, World War I is interesting. I mean, none in the Southern Negro Youth Congress, but there was certainly a rise of militants of African Americans who fought in the First World War, specifically the regiments that fought in France. They came home fighting. A lot of what happens in the Red Summer of 1919 is not just whites rioting and trying to kill African Americans, but what's significant about that summer is African Americans fighting back in places like Chicago and in other places in the country too. World War II, I think, the vets coming back, incredibly significant, right? Many historians claim that this is the start of the sort of modern, uppercase civil rights movement, right? They came home fighting and they weren't going to take segregation anymore. I think that's true, but I do think it's a little bit overstated. And I worry that too many historians are exaggerating that moment and they don't realize all of the activism that came during the war and in the late 1930s as well. That to me is what's generating this. Certainly the veterans coming home are adding a dimension to it that's fiery, that's radical. There's a photograph in my book, I don't know if it's in the South Carolina chapter, of a militant march of veterans who had come home to Alabama who are marching through the streets of Birmingham in 1945 or 46 for the right to vote. That's just one example of many. But, the reason I say I don't want to overstate that is because, it also kind of implies that, that's the one. It also kind of implies that the women who were home on the home front during World War II were somehow insignificant in what they were up to. And then it wasn't until the men came home that this thing started moving, right? That sort of, that version of the movement sort of puts women to the side, even when they were the ones running the show, in the 40s. And I think we have to acknowledge that as well.
All right. Okay. So, again, we'll wait for some more questions to come in via the chat. And again, please don't be shy. There's plenty to talk about here this evening with what Dr. Gellman has shared with us. One thing I do want to go back to is you refer both in your talk this evening and also in the chapter itself to this post-war moment of optimism amongst many activists, especially those based in the South. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Paint us a picture of what activists were thinking in 1945, 46, 47.
This is an example of where historians sometimes mess up. Too often, what happens is historians of modern US history go right from World War II to the Cold War. And it's almost like World War II ends and the Cold War starts the very next day. And that is so terrible because at the end of the war, there was no sense yet of what the post-war was going to look like. There was no inevitability that the way things developed with, Truman's kind of, throwing down the gauntlet, you're either with us or you're against us, and the Taft-Hartley Act and all of this repression, that was not like a foretold thing, right? And so what I think is really important is from 1945 to about 1947, there is a real optimism that a democratic mass movement for human rights was going to take place in the United States. And I don't think that optimism was misplaced. It turned out to not be the case because of an unparalleled amount of repression. but that possibility existed, right? It existed in, you know, Henry Wallace. It existed in the National Negro Congress. They met in Detroit in 1946, and they sent a petition to the UN on behalf of Negroes in America protesting human rights abuses. This was way before those other petitions that became more famous, right? They're really on the cutting edge here, and they're thinking that there's going to be a international democratic movement that's going to finish off what the war started in defeating fascism, right? And they see fascism around the world, but they also see it right in their hometowns in South Carolina. So it's important to remember that moment of optimism, and that the way people felt in 1945 was not like some kind of doom of like, oh my God, you know, McCarthyism's coming. And, you know, they didn't see into the future in that way. And, you know, sometimes historians read backwards too much when they do history. And you gotta look through the eyes of the people in the moment where they were participating in these movements.
Exactly right. And I would also add very quickly that it reminds me of something I think I may have mentioned to our students here, of what Lerone Bennett Jr. of Ebony Magazine called revolutionary time. The problem being revolutionaries and activists themselves don't know when revolutionary time has come, and they may either miss their window or they may overshoot it. But again, these moments in history don't come around very often, these moments of optimism for the future. But like you said, we can never see what's coming down the road. I wanted to pitch it back to Brett very quickly, because I know he has
Well,
something to add.
I just want to put another shovel of dirt on this question of how the human rights movement that was it didn't just start with the National Negro Youth Congress. I mean, Du Bois's Niagara movement in '05 had
Yeah.
a global perspective about colonialism, imperialism. They tied it together. They realized who was getting screwed over there was the same kind of people who were getting screwed here. And that was the school that Modjeska grew up in. Her mother was a member of the Niagara movement.
That is
So, you know,
interesting.
fast forward, and that you've got a really vibrant, growing movement fueled by the World War II and the fight against fascism and the brilliant leadership of the young people. And that what really I think needs to be more closely examined is Burns's role in that difference between the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. Burns, I'm a big fan of the book Sly and Abel, which is, I think that's backwards. But anyway, this is a biography about Jimmy Burns by David Robertson, where he really does put together Burns's positioning during his advice to Truman, and then he was Secretary of State, and he went against the Joint Chiefs of Staff and all of Truman's advisors in 1945 to drop the bomb. And so that dropping of the bomb was predicated by this guy who felt that we need a new other, and that the communists were the new other. And we had the Red Scare in 1919, another one from the 40s and 50s, and it was the Red Scare that wiped out that type of unity, multiracial unity, class conscious unity, global unity against the people that benefit from the wars. And so that shift from just talking about keeping black people in their place to fighting communism was huge, globally huge, predicated a lot of American foreign policy, and still does. And so I just want to throw that out there because it's something that needs to be chewed on for a good while to be able to digest.
For sure. Yeah.
Definitely. All right, so we got a few more questions in the chat. I think there is a comment Ian Anderson made a moment ago that I do want to kind of explore a bit more about the period between World War II and the Cold War, and really thinking about. I think this kind of brings us back to the broader history of Red Scares in U.S. history, right? And I don't want to put words in Ian's mouth, but I think what he's basically kind of getting at here is that, you know, before World War II, and certainly as the war is coming to an end, there are many officials in the U.S. government who kind of see Stalin and the Soviet Union as an eventual adversary. And I guess my question to you, just putting off what Ian's mentioned here, is even if there isn't, say, a McCarthy or a McCarthyism, so to speak, in the late 1940s, was the optimism that you see in 45, 46, 47, and this hope, this dream of a more democratic grassroots movement. And I know that as historians, we don't like to speculate on what could have happened, but
Yeah.
is there a way that groups like SNYC and other organizations could have turned the U.S. towards a different path in the late 1940s? Because I think there is a feeling amongst a lot of people who do the Cold War that even if things have been a little bit different in the U.S., there still would have been a confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's a tough counterfactual to answer. I guess I would say that some kind of antagonism sort of would have perhaps resulted no matter what, but the way that it came about in such in fracturing the world with no gray, and everything was, you're either with Team Soviet Union or Team USA in this Cold War. It was just so reductionist and terrible for all the people of color in the world, right? And so I want to believe that after the war, there was a chance for a democratic movement to flower in the United States without that level of repression, even if maybe they wouldn't have achieved everything they wanted, that there could have been space available for them to achieve more than what actually happened. And, I think about how by the late 1960s, it seemed like that space had opened up again in this country. But it took a lot of effort to break through that Cold War repression and, Cold War mentality, right? That had scared so many people. But on the other hand, you could make to argue the other side. What the early Cold War showed in America with repression and McCarthyism is that American liberalism was weak, right? Particularly white liberalism. That, as soon as there were signs of this happening, all the white liberal allies went running for the hills. And they were perfectly happy to throw their allies under the bus in the name of, individual success, in the name of getting promoted in the labor movement, in the name of all these other things, right? And, I think it's really important to acknowledge that so many people were victims of this era and sort of dethroned from their place of power and leadership. And the people who took their place, a lot of those faces were Black faces, but they were people who were willing to abide by the standards of the Cold War and a kind of straitjacketed liberalism. And I'm talking specifically here about the kinds of Black leadership that developed like in the late 40s and early 50s in the labor movement in particular, that was much less aggressive in terms of anti-racism and much more conciliatory. And these had been African Americans who hadn't been leaders in the labor movement, but they were promoted because they would play ball in this way. They would embrace this politics, and but especially white allies, they just really abandoned the larger premise of this movement, and I think that's important to note too. So maybe there are reasons for not being more optimistic about this, post-war movement flourishing, given, Ira Katz Nelson, this famous scholar, calls it the Southern cage of the New Deal. That the Southern white Democrats and white supremacy would only let things get so far before, they would get reined back in. And it was the Achilles heel of, New Deal policy that ingrained so much racism and inequality in the New Deal, despite what those policies accomplished. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely.
Debating myself here.
There's a lot of different directions we can go with in terms of that question. But actually, another interesting question in the chat that I think speaks to what you've talked about a lot this evening. Could you elaborate on the evolution of activism tactics and strategies from adult and youth activists during the 1930s and 40s?
Yeah, I think the title, of my book talks about militant civil rights, and by that I don't mean like military or anything. What I mean though is like what the NNC and the Southern Negro Youth Congress did was I feel like they really pioneered in the kind of street tactics that became more familiar later. That before the 1930s, it was not respectable to go to jail. It was not respectable to march in the street, to picket, to boycott, to do all these sort of more radical acts. And I would argue that, the Southern Negro Youth Congress helped change that in terms of what kind of tactics were acceptable tactics in the movement. And, before these groups came along in the 30s, you had groups like the NAACP who were very interested in sort of polite negotiations with white, elites and welfare paternalism, which, were tactics that these young people in particular thought were not going to do it, especially in the 1930s when the conditions became so dire, right? That people eventually started organizing through the unemployment councils, through the labor movement, and you see mass street action kind of activity. And I think the Black vanguard of this was the NNC and the SNYC. They catalyzed this. And, it's amazing to me to think that like in 1939, 1940, the NNC's leading police brutality marches in DC of like 1,000 people in the streets, right? I mean, it just speaks to 2021 so much, right? Like, I mean, they weren't chanting Black Lives Matter, but they may as well have been, and it always really catches my attention when on occasion I'll get an email or a tweet from someone who's in Black Lives Matter or around the movements today, and they find out about this and they're just like, oh my God, like they were doing this in 1939, 1940, right? It's just, yeah. So anyway, I got off topic a little bit, but
Well, back on that topic, the Birmingham event that Bull Connor slammed and shut down in 1948. In Birmingham, the month prior to that conference, had been 5 young black men killed by the police. And so, yeah, it's
yeah.
we just have everybody's got a camera now is one of the things that's happening.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean one of the great tragedies of 20th century United States history is how you really could just write a history or tell a history of civil rights and Black power and so forth just by focusing on police brutality, because that's such a big part of the movement in the 20th century in a way that I think most Americans today don't fully realize. Most people in the media especially seem to treat police brutality as a new thing every so often whenever it pops up in the news, even though it's been with us for an incredibly long time. And actually, this links to the next question I want to pose to you from the chat, talking about the role of historically Black colleges and universities in activism during this time period, as well as folks like Benjamin E. Mays and other religious leaders in the 30s and 40s.
Well, on the one hand, I think historically Black colleges are leading the way, but on the other hand, back to Langston Hughes, we forget that historically Black colleges, into the 1930s were very conservative, right? Going out at night, strict curfews, strict all kinds of social rules about what you could and couldn't do on these campuses. And, it was a carryover from the earlier period about respectability, right? About a Black intelligentsia, reflecting Du Bois's talented 10th ideas from that early period of the 20th century. But that starts to loosen up, which is really interesting. And I think you do start to get significant activism from these historically Black colleges and universities. And some of the smaller ones too. Virginia Union University in Richmond is where James Jackson got radicalized in 1935, right? Harbison Junior College in Irmo. You've got all these other schools as well, and they're generating a lot of the Southern Negro Youth Congress activists. They're coming out of these schools, and I think that's significant. Of course, the most sort of predominant school was Howard University, and this was a very complicated situation. Howard had some of the most preeminent Black intellectuals in the country, but their budget was controlled by the Senate Committee on DC Affairs, right? So whenever anything radical happened on Howard, all of a sudden Howard, the threat was, we're gonna pull all of your funding, right? Even with that threat though, what you saw in the late 1930s was remarkable. If you look at my book in the chapter about Richmond and the start of the SNYC, all of these famous Howard Black intellectuals are at the initial conference in Richmond, Virginia in 1937, including the president of Howard University. And you've got Ralph Bunche, you've got a number of faculty who are really radical at Howard University. Doxy Wilkerson comes out of Howard. So anyway, HBCUs, incredibly important, but we also have to remember that there was a politics there about, you want young people to be activists, you want them to do things, but you also need to perpetuate your institution that is short on funding, right? And, one of my favorite NNC activists, Ishmael Flory, who gets active on the West Coast and then in Chicago, he gets kicked out of Fisk University in the early 30s for protesting a lynching that happened nearby, right? You wouldn't think a historically Black college would kick a student out for doing that, but that was the way, especially in the early 30s, things hadn't changed yet. And you had to be really, the behavior, of students were very, very scrutinized, and there was a lot of severe punishment for going outside of the boundaries of respectability.
Definitely. And just to add to what Erik just said there, also one of the things about historically Black colleges in this time period, and really throughout their history, is that oftentimes Black students found themselves protesting against their own universities,
right,
time and time again, because, as Erik mentioned, they were often very conservative. In fact, one of the readings for our class next week actually deals with students at South Carolina State in Orangeburg, who were protesting in the 50s and 60s, well before the Orangeburg massacre happens. And as someone who teaches at an HBCU now at Claflin University, I can tell you that history of activism is one that students are always interested in. I can tell you that students I've had at Claflin, when they talk about wanting to get involved in activism, I remind them that being at a place like Claflin or being across the fence from SC State, they are a part of a tradition of Black students who protested not just injustices in Orangeburg or in South Carolina, but protested against things on their own campuses, which again, I think is an incubation place for a lot of these activist movements throughout the 20th century. And real quick, the second part of that question was about religious leaders like Benjamin Mays and others. Do you have anything to add about that as well?
Yeah, I mean, so Ben Mays is always someone who's close to me because I actually went to college at Bates College, and Ben Mays went to Bates College as well. And I spent a lot of time at Morehouse when I was a college student because they had this great exchange program. But yeah, Ben Mays was somewhat supportive. Clergy was a complicated situation, because a lot of Black ministers were also relying on elite whites for various funding, right? So early on in the book, I talk about how Chicago, one of the big efforts was to turn Black churches around to be in favor of the labor movement as a kind of civil rights, agenda. And it took a lot of coercion and pressure from the congregations of those ministers to turn those ministers around and say, okay, maybe I'm not going to fix the roof of my church this year because I'm not going to get any donations anymore. But I've got to support this movement of steelworkers because so many Black workers are going to benefit as a result of this, right? And so similarly in Richmond, they found a couple of key ministers who embraced that movement. In Birmingham, same. There were always ministers that were against them because they were so radical. And of course, there were some ministers who were severely anti-communist, right? And who believed in all the kind of ideas that like communists were atheists and they didn't believe in God, et cetera. But they found allies who were in the church. Although I would say a key distinction between the movement that Southern Negro Youth Congress was in and the movement that comes up in the mid-1950s is that mid-1950s movement really comes out of the church, right? It comes out of like a middle-class church. Whereas the earlier movement, less so, I would say. The earlier movement really comes out of working class communities and labor movement, workplaces,
Erik, you used a term that has been one that I just glommed onto in the transition of the militant human rights movement to the domesticated civil rights movement. And I'm really close to that and can see it in what happened to Modjeska and how she got iced and then who took her place.
Yeah.
And they were just Booker T accommodationists. I mean, maybe I'm simplifying it, but the fact is there seems to be a leadership in South Carolina for many decades that prevailed longer than certainly in North Carolina and Georgia of the notion that we're going to fix the problems within the system that created them, as opposed to a militant approach that we need a new system and we're going to raise hell to get there. Speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it must have been really traumatizing for these, activists to watch these people take their place who had been their kind of, who had been sort of marginal people before that, and then they became sort of center stage. I don't want to demean all of the people who took their place, right? Like one of the great leaders of the 20th century, who you can talk about in terms of continuity is A. Philip Randolph, right? He starts up in Harlem in the 20s as a socialist orator. He organizes Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He's the president of the National Negro Congress from 1936 to 1940, but resigns because of all of the tumult around the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact and the sort of political, moves that are happening on the left during that period. But, Randolph, because of his anti-communism, continues to thrive through the Cold War and all the way up into, the March on Washington and beyond. And, I think that's important to realize, but I also think it's important to understand that by focusing on people like Randolph, you're missing the larger picture of the people who didn't have that continuity. And you have to ask the question of like, well, where were the activists who were in one era really significant, but they didn't make it to the other side, to that next era, right? And why? So I think that's, important to understand, right?
It gets painful when you're old enough to have people that did things that are still alive and their children are still alive. It's harder to talk about. It's easier to critique history when everybody's dead.
That's true.
But what happened here in the domestication of the civil rights movement, we saw in 1969 this upsurge of the United Citizens Party. And this was at a time when there were no black elected officials. I was in college. They just had the Orangeburg Massacre. It was a militant time. And so the Democratic Party, under the pressure of a black upsurge and trying to exercise democracy, same thing that happened in 1942 with the Progressive Democratic Party, happened again 20 plus years later, where black people organized to participate within the system. And the Democrats came in with 3 people that they chose to be the chosen ones to open up the Democratic Party to black participation. But the problem is, the painful thing is, most people didn't see that. And certainly now we look back on the leadership of the NAACP and et cetera, without understanding the way that the people that had a much more committed engagement in human rights and understanding how the dots are connected in a material society that Dr. King understood, that those distinctions are blurred, and that's part of that history being erased stuff that we try and bring up and continue to.
Yeah.
And you've done a wonderful job of, by the way.
I mean, it's fascinating how many local NAACP chapters participate with Southern Negro Youth Congress and NNC, but like their national leadership, they're just too obsessed with their own status, and they think that, you know, here's this new radical group that's trying to steal our thunder and we don't like their tactics. And, you know, so people like Walter White, you know, their behavior towards the, you know, the sort of young activists is kind of deplorable, in that they're trying to short circuit what they're doing. But, you know, there's people like Charles Hamilton Houston in the NAACP who totally got the Southern Negro Youth Congress. A very young Thurgood Marshall, you know, is corresponding with the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And maybe this is a moment where I can actually put in a plug for any young scholars or old scholars who wants to do more research. Sitting at Howard University in the Moreland Spingarn archives are all of the papers of the Southern Negro Youth Congress. They're not really organized. They're in boxes that say things like South Carolina, Alabama, and that's it. And then you go in the box and you find what's in there. Why aren't people using these papers? I only scratched the surface, right? I was talking about the Southern Negro Youth Congress in one chapter in Richmond, and in another chapter in Alabama, and then in a third chapter in South Carolina. There were councils in New Orleans, all throughout Tennessee. There were tons of them in Florida. What were they doing? I don't know, right? Like, it's infuriating to me that people, you know, I was, when I wrote Death Blow to Jim Crow, I said in the intro, this is supposed to be the first book about the National Negro Congress, not the last book, right? And I'm just hoping that other people take up the gauntlet and look at these fascinating papers, you know, where these young people are going to Cuba, they're going to Latin America. You know, Esther Cooper Jackson goes to London and a major international conference, then travels all the way to the Soviet Union, you know, and it's just, I don't know, there's just so much more of this activism to even uncover.
I have to give credit at this point to Graham Duncan, who helped us start the Modjeska School, who is the up-and-coming, soon-to-be probably someday the director of the South Caroliniana. There's an Indiana on the end of that library, which is the oldest freestanding library in America, where all the old papers used to go. And that Graham spent time in the Howard archives, and some of the stuff that's in Becky's book, History Denied, which we mailed copies to all you folks, and hopefully those students anyway got it. And if you didn't get History Denied, it's online at Modjeska. No, it's online at scpronet.com. And that the work that Graham did in digging up stuff helped us learn better about what happened. But the loss of the information is so much more profound than the absence of it, or I guess equally profound, and works together.
Oh, indeed. And I may or may not have been writing down that information about the SNYC papers at Howard, but I digress. There's another good question in the chat, though, that actually relates back to the SNCC conference in Columbia, specifically Esther Cooper Jackson.
Yeah.
There's a question about, I'm remembering from part of the speech that you read earlier, that Esther Cooper Jackson described South Carolina as, quote, the social heart of the Deep South, end quote. What exactly do you think she meant by that?
I think, you know, I could send you as a copy of the document of the full speech so we could look at it more closely. But just off the top of my head, trying to remember, I think what she was referencing is the history of South Carolina in terms of African-American history. Two things. One is that the first slaves were forcibly brought to the coast of South Carolina and the Sea Islands, right? And she's aware of that. And second, I think Reconstruction that happened in South Carolina. So that there's something about South Carolina as being kind of the heart of the Black South, but also I think the heart of, you know, a sort of Southern movement. And I think, you know, that's what attracted so many of these young people to South Carolina in 1946, where they felt like that was the place to announce this kind of new, sort of formulate and implement this new plan for liberation. And I don't know, you tell me, does South Carolina have that potential? Does its history suggest that?
I would certainly say so. I mean, I think one of the things about the Modjeska School that we're really emphasizing is that the state of South Carolina has both this incredibly depressing history of reactionary leaders and conservatism and the like, but also has this rich history of activism and resistance to those reactionary movements. And I think a lot of folks around the country often gloss over South Carolina, but as we all know, the state has produced your John C. Calhouns, your Ben Tillmans, your James Burns, and so forth. But it's also produced people like in the Modjeska Simkins or Septima Clark, or Robert Smalls or Robert Elliott, and so on and so forth. And so the state, again, has within it the potential to do some terrible things for the country, but also some great things for the country as well, and for the world.
Connecting the dots that go way back to Denmark basically being hung with 30-something other people, there's a history in South Carolina that seems to influence our more immediate past. And one of the things that in my life I've seen is that in the 1960s, when I'm involved with Southern Student Organizing Committee, I knew progressive legislators in North Carolina and in Georgia. And I mean, Bond was kicked out of the legislature in 1968 in Georgia because of his opposition to the war in Vietnam. It wasn't until 1990, well, it wasn't until 1970 black people were elected in South Carolina, and it wasn't until 1992 when Joe Neal and Gilda Carbona were elected that I felt that we had some kind of ideological rapport with anybody that had been elected. That the people that had been elected prior to that were the ones the white folks supported. And Gilda and Joe were a hurricane of fresh air. They got together with us. They helped start the Progressive Network after the '94 election. And so we've been behind the times for a reason. And it may be because of the oppression. It may be because of the co-optation. But this is a thesis for somebody, hopefully as a student listening to this, who will write that paper before I die so I can read it.
Oh, definitely. Are there any additional questions anybody wants to put in the chat? I do have one other question, Erik, and I'm not sure if you can answer this or not, but during the course of your research in the original SNCC, did you come across civil rights leaders from future generations, from like the 60s and 70s, for instance, who were aware of the SNYC? Because it seems that a lot of folks who were involved in activism during the civil rights movement proper that most folks know in the 50s and 60s had never heard of this SNYC before.
Right. Yeah. There are some connections. Do you know the historian Waldo Martin?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah. So Waldo and I spent some time together on this program a few years ago, and he was in the middle then of writing this article that was trying to connect the first SNCC to the second SNCC, and he had figured out all kinds of sort of indirect and direct connections between SNCC people and one SNCC and the next SNCC. But that said, you know, some of the original SNCC people, I know that Waldo or others asked them explicitly, like, were you aware of the Southern Negro Youth Congress? And they were like, oh no, like I had no idea about this. And had I known, I would have been so enthusiastic about it, right? You know, people like Julian Bond, for example, was asked this a lot, you know, and he said, no, I wasn't aware of it. But there were connections, you know. I mentioned one, which is not to SNCC, but certainly like Angela Davis, all of her formative years, she was basically brought up by a bunch of first SNCC generation people, and it shows in her politics, I think.
Angela's mother was at the SNCC conference in 1946.
Right.
Julian Bond's father was at the SNCC conference in 1946. Ella Baker knew about the Southern Negro Youth Congress.
Well, Ella Baker was in the NNC when it first started in 1935, but shortly thereafter she dropped out. I think it was because, you know, she had always had a little bit of a fear about associating with communists going back. So She was part of the sponsoring committee for the New York City NNC in like 35 and 36. I saw her name on letterhead, and then she just kind of drops out, and she of course becomes a great activist through different channels and through a lot of, you know, maybe she should have joined the NNC because her experience with the NAACP was not a very positive one, right? I'm trying to think of other key connections. You know, Revels Caton is the head of the NNC in its very end years. I don't know if you've heard that name before. He's the grandson of Hiram Revels. Hiram Revels was the first senator, you know, he was elected to Jefferson Davis's seat in Reconstruction, a black man put into the Senate from Mississippi, right? And here's his grandson leading the NNC in 1945, right? And he becomes a significant activist on the West Coast, along with Matt Crawford and others who were NNC people. What's interesting is a lot of NNC people, they don't necessarily have a connection to like the liberal civil rights movement, but they have a lot of connection to Black Power stuff, right? Which shows that, like, you know, this like putting Black Power over here and civil rights over here is a big mistake, right? And that these activists never saw it that way. And they certainly were, you know, NNC and SNYC were not Black nationalists per se. They were not Garveyites, although some of them were former Garveyites who went into the NNC and sort of hid that dimension of their past. But they never privileged, they never believed in a kind of like liberal interracialism. They always were understanding of the importance of a kind of Black vanguard and the importance of race, right? They weren't trying to minimize race.
Dr. Gallman put something in the chat thing a little while ago about how history is cyclical, and this the business of, they use the term silos now, but I mean, there was a time in it was 64, the white people left SNCC, and that was because we understood, or I was in high school. I didn't get involved with SOC until 66 in college, but it was at a time when it was understood that the white students ought to go talk to white students. And so there was a parting of the ways for strategic reasons. And then, and I mean, those type of things keep happening. And the analysis needs to be as to what's the strategic reason for that separation. And I'm worried that now that some of the strategic reason for pushing white people away from the Black movement, or Black people away from the white movement, or whatever it is more of kind of a personal perspective of oppression rather than a strategic togetherness of overcoming it. Dr. Gilman, speak to that question for me.
Well, one thing I can tell you is that a lot of African Americans in the NNC and the SNYC really believed in a kind of interracial movement in the 30s and 40s, but they really also felt betrayed in this period we're talking about in the post-war, when many white allies kind of abandoned them. And, you know, McCarthyism cast a really wide net, and in particular, it was interested in attacking African-American activists. They weren't really interested in top-level communists. They were interested in the people who were really on the ground making social change, right? So, you know, there's this anecdote at the end of the book, I think I tell it in the book, where it's like someone's on the West Coast, I think it's like Revels Caton, and he's talking to some white leftist guy, and this guy says, Paul Robeson isn't just African American. He doesn't think of himself as Black. He's a citizen of the world. And Revels Caton basically tries to punch him in the face because it's just such a misunderstanding of what's happening, right? And a kind of Black-led movement there, where even like white allies who are trying to sort of be there are misunderstanding what's happening, and they're, you know, trying to minimize race or suggest that there's like a kind of post-racial world that they're going to achieve or something like that. You know, which I don't think is something that the Southern Negro Youth Congress, you know, the National Negro Congress, those leaders did not believe in that kind of liberal sort of interracial movement. They saw something much more radical and that was affirming African-American identity.
right. So I want to. I think we're almost out of time. We've got a few minutes left. I did want to pose another question to you, and this is again tying to what the school is all about, which is with the Modjeska Simkins School for Human Rights. What we often emphasize is how history is not just important for the sake of knowing it, but it's important for the sake of activism, for organizing, and the like. And so, with that in mind, what would you say are maybe a couple of lessons or a big lesson that the SNYC's rise and fall can provide to activists in 2021? Of course, acknowledging that the circumstances and such are a bit different, but there are still many things we can learn from them in the here and now.
Yeah. Gosh. I mean, I think the creativity of their activism is important to realize. The sort of broad notion that they had of what freedom meant to them in terms of like freedom from, economic exploitation, but also freedom in terms of, bodily movement, like in terms of, not being, not fearing, racial violence from the police or from other citizens, right? And so that sort of broad way that eventually becomes an international way that they understand liberation, I think is really important. Second, I think the way that they saw the labor movement, in particular working class people, as being the means to achieve their ends, I think is important. It's hard to think about that right now when labor unions are at their lowest numbers, since the New Deal, et cetera. But I think a broad-based social movement for economic justice that's Black-led, I think will come out of the working class, right? And I think it's important to understand that those organic leaders exist, and they have the ability, given the right circumstances, to develop a kind of mass movement. And I think we're seeing that to some degree, in the present moment, that a lot of leaderless people are marching, and a lot of working class people are reading and thinking about, movement strategy, et cetera. They're not relying on other people to tell them what to do or to lead them into anything. And that was what the NNC was all about. It wasn't a top-down organization that, where the leaders in Washington or Birmingham said, okay, local chapters, here's what you have to do. There was a total flexibility at the grassroots level in places like Birmingham or New Orleans or Miami or wherever to say, well, where are you at? What's your issue, right? And that's why things developed in this movement in a very uneven way, but in a very creative way. Like, where in DC, the issue was police brutality, but in Chicago, the issue was getting African Americans into steel worker unions and packing houses as a means to achieve power through that dimension, right? In Richmond, it was about tobacco workers, but in South Carolina, it was about teachers, schools. It was, so that kind of flexibility in a movement, I think, is really important, and a great lesson from this earlier SNCC movement as well.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Oh, one last thing, sorry.
Sure.
there is a select group of leaders that are so impressive to me. The Burnhams, Esther Cooper Jackson, James Jackson, Edward Strong and his partner, and a few others. They not only had these kind of ecumenical, anti-racist, anti-misogynist politics, but they lived it. Like the way they lived their own lives were lives of great sort of equality. Their partnerships were partnerships of equality, right? And I just think that too is really important, right? That they tried to live the world that they wanted, if that makes sense.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. And that's a perfect place for us to end tonight's festivities. Again, Thank you so much, Erik Gellman, for giving such a great talk this evening on a very important topic. Everyone, please give him a virtual round of applause. So we gotta put your kid to bed, and also the cats were getting kind of antsy back there for a moment.
Yeah, those cats are crazy.
But
Erik, we will be uncovering your graveyard down here. I mean, figuratively, but we're going to find it and bring you home.
The Jewish cemetery, that's the only thing, you know, where the university has tried to put up all these big sports facilities over on that one part of campus. The only piece of land they can't touch is this tiny little cemetery right next to the football stadium. And that's where my ancestors are buried.
We shall make a memorial there.
Well, thank you. Well, those questions were amazing, and I'm just catching up on a lot of this like knowledge in the chat. Your students are super knowledgeable. Can someone save the chat for me? Actually, I would love to just read through it after the fact.
We certainly will.
All right. Good.
And Erik, you can run, but you cannot hide. You're much closer to us now than you've been for a long time.
I'm not hiding from anyone. Anytime you want me to come to South Carolina, and once the revolution starts down there, just count me in.
Well, thank you, sir. We will be in touch. And what we want to do now is to let Erik go put his 3-year-old to bed. And Dr. Green's got papers are great, I think. But we want to stay around and do what it is we would do if we were like having a regular school class. After class, we'd hang out and chat. And so if a few of you want to stay and ask questions or get to know each other better, we're going to do that right after a tune. And so stay if you want to. Go do whatever you got to do. But this is a continuum. We won't stop. And the next Monday is our class. What is our class?
Class 5.
Class 5, May 3rd. As we've taught more about what happened in terms of the way the domesticated civil rights movement started playing out in South Carolina to kind of put the damper on the whole question of letting people of color have a little more freedom, but not really. And so stay tuned. There's reading is posted. The reading is posted. And those of you that did not, if you're any students that are in this class and didn't get Becky's book, send us an email and we'll make sure you get one. And if you're not a student and you want the book, send us an email and we'll mail you one, and you'll pay the postage. Thank you, Erik. Thanks
again. I'm going to sign off. And anyone who wants to be in touch with me, you can easily find me, egellman@unc.edu. And I'm going to send at least one person a copy of the book. And if you want a copy of the book, let me know. Get in touch. And if you got questions, get in touch, etc. Thanks so much. This is great.
Come again, Erik.
All right.
Daniel, play some tunes and let's take a break.